The icy summons. The frigid air of the High Command office bit at Klaus Richter's cheeks, a premonition of the journey to come. Outside, the perpetual gray of a Berlin winter clung to the windows, mirroring the grim reality of the war. Inside, the room was Spartan, dominated by a large, polished oak desk, behind which sat General Albrecht, his face a mask of impenetrable resolve. Klaus stood at attention, his breath misting faintly in the chill. He'd been summoned without explanation, a common enough occurrence in these strained times, but the urgency in the aide's voice had been unmistakable. "Richter," General Albrecht began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "You've proven your capacity for discretion and resourcefulness on countless occasions. Your record in the Carpathian Mountains, your engineering solutions on the Eastern Front, they speak volumes." Klaus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the rare praise without betraying any emotion. His mind, ever analytical, was already attempting to decipher the general's preamble. This wasn't a commendation for past service. It was the prelude to a new, undoubtedly demanding assignment. Albrecht pushed a thick sealed dossier across the desk. "This is classified level Omega. You will not speak of its contents to anyone, not even your most trusted subordinates, until the appropriate time. Violation carries the highest penalty." His gaze, sharp and unblinking, bored into Klaus. Klaus picked up the dossier. The paper felt cold and heavy in his gloved hand. "Understood, General." "Good. Inside you will find your new orders. Your mission, Captain, is to construct a facility, a very specific facility in an unconventional location." Albrecht paused, allowing the implication to settle. "The Arctic, specifically a remote island north of Svalbard." A flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed, crossed Klaus's features. The Arctic. The name conjured images of endless ice, biting winds, and a desolation that dwarfed even the most desolate battlefields. His engineering mind immediately began calculating the immense logistical challenges. "You will be given a small, hand-picked crew, specialists in their fields, though they will not be privy to the full scope of the project. Your cover story will be a meteorological station. However, the true purpose of this facility is far more critical to the future of the Reich." Albrecht leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It is to be a sanctuary." Arrival at the Ghost Fjord. The grinding shriek of ice against the hull finally ceased, replaced by the howl of the wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. Captain Klaus Richter stood on the small ship's deck, gripping the frigid metal railing, watching the desolate landscape unfold. The Nordwind, a sturdy, ice-strengthened freighter, had navigated the treacherous waters north of Svalbard, pushing, through flows that felt less like obstacles and more like the teeth of some ancient beast. Now it rested, its engines cut, in the narrow confines of what charts vaguely labeled Fjord of Whispers. To Klaus, it felt more like the Ghost Fjord. The air bit with a ferocity he'd only ever imagined. Fine snow, like powdered glass, whipped across the deck, stinging his exposed cheeks. The sky above was a bruised gray, merging seamlessly with the towering jagged peaks that rose abruptly from the frozen sea. There was no sign of life, no tree, no shrub, just an endless monochrome expanse of rock and snow. The isolation was profound, a physical weight pressing down on his chest. "Well, Captain," Sergeant Otto Muller's gruff voice cut through the wind, "looks like we've found the end of the world." Otto, bundled in layers of heavy wool and canvas, stomped his feet, a cloud of snow puffing from his boots. "Might as well be on the moon." Klaus nodded, his gaze sweeping across the fjord. "It's pristine, Sergeant. Unspoiled, exactly as the general described." He felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the unsettling stillness of the place. It was beautiful in its starkness, but also terrifying in its raw indifference. Below them, the gangplank rattled down, an incongruous sound in the immense silence. Private Ernst Schmidt, a young man whose usual jovial nature had been slowly eroded by weeks at sea, stumbled slightly as he stepped onto the snow-covered shore. He adjusted the heavy pack on his back, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Captain, it's colder than I expected," he managed, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. Klaus watched him, a flicker of concern in his eyes. Schmidt was a good soldier, but the Arctic was a different kind of enemy. "Keep moving, Schmidt. Stay warm. We set up camp first, then we talk." Corporal Lars Knudsen, a man of few words and even fewer visible emotions, was already offloading equipment with an efficient, practiced ease. His eyes, the color of glacial ice, constantly scanned the surroundings, taking in every nuance of the unforgiving terrain. He moved with a quiet competence, a stark contrast to the slightly bewildered expressions of the other men. Dr. Ingrid Weiss, her face partially obscured by a thick fur-lined hood, emerged from the ship's interior, carrying a heavy case of geological instruments. She walked with a determined stride, her gaze fixed not on the bleakness, but on the exposed rock faces towering above them. "Captain Richter," she called out, her voice crisp despite the cold, "the geological formations are fascinating, a clear example of significant uplift and erosion. This could be ideal." Klaus felt a momentary surge of purpose. Ingrid's scientific detachment was a welcome anchor in the swirling unease. "Ideal for what, Doctor?" he asked, though he knew the answer. She gestured broadly with a gloved hand. "For concealment, Captain. A natural fortress. The rock here is granite, I believe. Incredibly stable, incredibly difficult to penetrate without the right tools." The first order of business was shelter. The men, their movements stiff with cold and fatigue, began to unload the prefabricated sections of their temporary barracks. It was a utilitarian structure, designed for rapid assembly and maximum protection against the elements, but even so, the work was arduous. The wind tore at the canvas, threatening to rip the sections from their grasp. Snow collected in every crevice, making their footing treacherous. Otto grumbled, wrestling with a stubborn bolt. "This place doesn't want us here. I can feel it. The spirits of the ice don't like visitors." "Just focus on the task, Sergeant," Klaus instructed, his own hands numb despite his heavy gloves. He worked alongside them, hauling timber, securing guy lines, setting an example of tireless resolve. He knew his men looked to him, and he could not afford to falter. As the sun, a pale, anemic disk, began its slow descent towards the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the fjord, the rudimentary camp began to take shape. A single large tent, reinforced with timber frames, stood against the wind. Inside, a small field stove crackled, offering a meager but vital warmth. The air was thick with the scent of canvas, sweat, and wood smoke. Klaus stepped outside, leaving the dim light and the low murmur of his men behind. He walked to the edge of their small clearing, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. The silence was immense, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the distant, rhythmic creak of the ship. The giant's mouth. The blizzard, an untamed beast of ice and wind, had clawed at them for 3 days, blurring the already indistinct line between the sky and the frozen earth. Klaus pushed through it, each step a deliberate act of will against the biting cold and the snow that swirled up to his waist in drifts. His breath plumed white, a fleeting ghost in the Arctic gloom. Mueller, his face a mask of discomfort beneath a rime of ice, stumbled behind him, muttering low curses about spirits of the north. Schmidt, perpetually weary, trudged silently, his shovel a familiar weight. Only Knudsen seemed truly at home, his gait sure even on the treacherous ice-slicked rock, his eyes scanning the swirling white for something only he could see. Dr. Weiss, bundled in layers of insulated gear that muted her usual sharp movements, was a different kind of relentless. She moved with a purpose that transcended the physical hardship, her geologist's hammer a constant companion, tapping against exposed rock faces whenever the wind offered a brief reprieve. She wasn't looking for a path, but for a story etched in granite. "The general specifications are precise, Captain," she'd stated on their first morning of scouting, her voice surprisingly crisp despite the cold. "Dense, stable rock, no major fault lines, and of course, a natural concealment that can be reinforced." Klaus remembered her words as he watched her now, a small figure silhouetted against a momentary lightening in the sky. She chipped a sample from a sheer cliff face, examining it with a jeweler's loupe, her brow furrowed in concentration. The wind whipped at her hair, but she remained oblivious, lost in the silent language of stone. Days bled into one another, marked only by the growing ache in their bones and the slow consumption of their rations. They traversed a landscape of jagged peaks and deep-shadowed ravines, the Fjord of Whispers living up to its name with the constant, mournful cry of the wind. Klaus felt the isolation seep into him, a chilling presence that echoed the vast emptiness around them. He drove his men, not with shouted orders, but with his own unwavering example, his silence a heavier burden than any command. One afternoon, as a particularly vicious gust of wind nearly ripped the hood from his head, Klaus saw Knudsen stop abruptly, his gaze fixed on a distant, unassuming section of a cliff face. There was no obvious crevice, no dramatic overhang, just a uniform gray expanse. Yet, something in Knudsen's posture, a sudden stillness, caught Klaus's attention. "What is it, Corporal?" Klaus asked, his voice low, almost lost in the wind's roar. Knudsen didn't respond immediately. He simply raised a gloved hand, pointing. "The air," he finally said, his voice a gravelly murmur. "It shifts there, and the snow. It doesn't settle the same." Dr. Weiss, alerted by their pause, made her way over, her movements surprisingly agile over the uneven terrain. She peered in the direction Knudsen indicated, her scientific skepticism battling with a nascent curiosity. "A thermal anomaly, perhaps," she mused, more to herself than to them, "or a strong, localized updraft." They pressed on, the subtle clues guiding them. As they drew closer, the snow indeed seemed to thin in a particular vertical band along the cliff, as if a constant, invisible breath kept it at bay. The air, too, felt subtly different, a less biting cold, perhaps, or a strange, almost damp quality in the otherwise desiccated air. "It's a shadow, Captain," Muller grumbled, adjusting his pack. "The mountain plays tricks." But Klaus felt a prickle of anticipation. He trusted Knudsen's instincts, honed by a lifetime in this unforgiving land. They reached the base of the cliff, the sheer rock rising hundreds of feet above them, a formidable, unyielding wall. Dr. Weiss began her methodical examination, tapping, scraping, and analyzing. She ran her hand along the rock face, her fingers tracing invisible lines. "Granite," she confirmed, her voice holding a note of satisfaction. "Solid, excellent compressive strength." Then her eyes widened. "And look here." She pointed to a faint, barely perceptible fissure, almost perfectly camouflaged by the natural striations of the rock. It wasn't a crack, but a line, a hint of separation. As they studied it, a low rumble, faint but distinct, echoed from deep within the cliff. It sounded like the mountain itself, sighing. "An entrance," Klaus said, the words a quiet exhalation of relief and dread. With renewed vigor, they cleared away the snow and loose scree. What emerged was not a simple crack, but a colossal fissure obscured by millennia of wind-blown snow and rockfall. It was a gaping maw, a dark vertical slit in the granite, easily wide enough for a man to enter, its depths shrouded in an impenetrable gloom. The air flowing from it was still, almost warm, a stark contrast to the biting wind outside. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something ancient and undisturbed. Knudsen, ever observant, knelt, running his hand along the floor of the nascent entrance. "No tracks," he stated, his voice hushed. "No beast has made this its den." Dr. Weiss, her face alight with scientific triumph, produced a powerful torch from her pack. She aimed its beam into the darkness. The light struggled against the immensity within, revealing only the initial stretch of a vast natural tunnel, its walls glistening with ice and moisture, disappearing into a seemingly endless blackness. It was a cathedral carved by geological time, a secret held by the Arctic for untold ages. "It's perfect," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "A giant's mouth, Captain, and it's ours." Battling the ice roads. The grinding roar of the icebreaker. Fenris echoed across the frigid water, a sound that had become the unwelcome anthem of their existence. Captain Richter stood on the makeshift jetty, a gaunt silhouette against the perpetually gray sky, his breath pluming like smoke. Every muscle in his body was coiled with a tension that never seemed to fully dissipate. The Fenris, an aging beast of steel and rivets, was a critical lifeline, but a fragile one. "She's coming in too fast, Captain." Sergeant Miller's voice, rough as gravel, cut through the wind. He gestured with a mittened hand towards the hulking vessel, which seemed to be wrestling an invisible demon beneath the surface. Richter narrowed his eyes. The pack ice, dense and unforgiving, had tightened its grip overnight. The ship, already listing slightly from a previous collision, carved a slow, agonizing path, its bow groaning in protest. Suddenly, a colossal slab of ice, the size of a small house, bucked beneath the Fenris, sending a spray of frozen water high into the air. The ship lurched violently to port, her stern rising alarmingly from the water. Men on deck scrambled, their shouts swallowed by the wind. "Damn it, man! Hold her steady!" Richter muttered, his knuckles white as he clenched his binoculars. For a terrifying moment, the Fenris hung suspended, teetering on the brink of capsizing, a testament to the Arctic's brutal indifference. Then, with a shudder that resonated even on shore, she slowly righted herself, steam hissing from battered pipes. Muller let out a long, shaky breath. "The North doesn't want us here, Captain. Not a single bit of it." His superstition was a constant companion, especially when the elements turned against them. Richter merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the ship as it finally scraped against the wooden pilings. The ramp lowered with a protesting screech, and a line of exhausted men began the arduous task of unloading. Crates, some bearing the grim insignia of the Wehrmacht, were hoisted out, many waterlogged or crushed. A pallet of tinned rations split open, spilling its contents across the ice. "Half of this is ruined." Private Schmidt's voice, usually bright, was laced with despair as he surveyed a pile of splintered lumber. "What good is a hammer if the handle snapped?" Muller kicked at a damaged crate of medical supplies. "It's a miracle anything gets here at all, Schmidt. Try telling that to the general, though. He probably thinks we're having a picnic." He paused, shaking his head. "This cold, it gets into everything, into the men, into the machines, into the very soul of the place." Later that afternoon, a different kind of roar split the air, the high-pitched whine of engines struggling against gale-force winds. 3 Junkers, Ju-52 transport planes, their wings encrusted with rime, appeared as dark specks against the churning gray sky. The makeshift ice runway, marked by oil drums and flickering flares, was barely visible through the swirling snow. "They're coming in low," Richter observed, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. Not that it would do any good against a falling aircraft, but it was a familiar comfort. The lead plane bounced violently on its approach, its landing gear skittering across the uneven ice. For a heart-stopping moment, it veered sharply, threatening to plunge into the frozen bay. The men on the ground, accustomed to the chaos, held their breath. With a final sickening lurch, the pilot wrestled the plane back onto the runway, bringing it to a juddering halt. The other 2 followed, their landings equally perilous. As the cargo doors opened, a blast of icy air mixed with the smell of aviation fuel assaulted them. Out came more crates, some dented, others leaking precious contents. A stack of canvas tarpaulins, meant to shield their fledgling camp, lay shredded. "Fuel drums are half empty, Captain," a weary ground crewman reported, his face blue with cold. "Looks like they lost a fair bit in transit." Richter knelt, running a gloved hand over a frozen burst pipe intended for their heating system. The cold was a constant, insidious enemy, damaging, weakening, and slowly eroding their carefully laid plans. The general's deadline loomed, a phantom weight on his shoulders. He knew the cost of failure. He looked at Schmidt, whose face was etched with a combination of exhaustion and frustration. "Schmidt, assess the damage to the heating pipes. Muller, try to salvage what you can from those fuel drums. Every drop counts." Muller nodded, his gruff demeanor momentarily softened by a flicker of understanding. "Aye, Captain, we'll do what we can. But I'm telling you, this place, it doesn't just break things, it tries to break us." Richter watched the men, their figures stooped against the driving snow, battling not just the damaged supplies but the relentless spirit-crushing environment. He felt the weight of their weariness, their growing despondency. He knew Muller was right. The Arctic wasn't just a physical challenge, it was a psychological one, and the struggle to simply exist, let alone build a fortress, was only just beginning. The storm's fury. The air inside the fissure hummed with a new, industrious energy. Drills, powered by the last of the Fenris's generator fuel, bit into the frozen rock, their high-pitched whine echoing against the cavern walls. Men, their breath pluming white, wielded picks and shovels, chipping away at ancient ice and permafrost, the rhythmic clang and scrape a stark contrast to the Arctic's usual silence. Private Schmidt, sweat beading on his brow despite the frigid temperature, worked a hand drill, his muscles aching. He glanced at Corporal Knudsen, who, with an almost unnerving efficiency, cleared away debris with a long-handled shovel, his movements fluid and economical. Captain Richter watched from a makeshift observation point, a hand pressed against the cold rock. Dr. Weiss stood beside him, her face smudged with dust and ice, examining a geological sample under a battery-powered lamp. "Remarkable," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "The stability of this formation. It's a natural fortress, Captain." Richter merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over the determined faces of his men. They were making progress, slow but steady, carving out the initial chambers for what would become their sanctuary. Sergeant Muller, always pragmatic, approached Richter, wiping his gloved hand across his bristly mustache. "Sir, the men are tired. We've pushed them hard, and the wind picked up outside. I don't like the look of it." Richter felt the subtle tremor in the rock, a deep vibration that wasn't from the drills. "Maintain the pace, Sergeant. We need to establish the outer perimeter before the next storm hits." The meteorological readings were concerning. Muller grumbled, "Concerning is an understatement, sir. This place has a temper. It feels like it's just been waiting for us to get comfortable." The temper manifested with terrifying speed. Without warning, the rhythmic drone of the drills was suddenly swallowed by a monstrous roar from outside. A deafening howl tore through the air, shaking the very bedrock. Dust, dislodged by the vibrations, rained down from the cavern ceiling. "What in God's name?" Schmidt cried, dropping his drill. Richter's command cut through the rising panic. "Everyone inside! Secure the entrance!" But it was too late. The storm hit like a physical blow. A wall of white slammed against the fissure's mouth, a blizzard of unprecedented fury. Within moments, the pale light filtering in from outside vanished, replaced by an impenetrable churning gray. The wind shrieked, a banshee's wail that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The temperature plummeted, and a fine, stinging ice began to seep through the smallest cracks in the rock. Men scrambled, dropping tools, their faces etched with fear. Sergeant Muller wrestled with a heavy canvas tarp, attempting to rig it across the entrance, but the wind tore at it with savage strength, ripping it from his grasp. "It's no use," he yelled over the din, his voice hoarse. "It's too strong." Private Schmidt huddled against a rock face, his eyes wide with terror. "We're going to be buried." Dr. Weiss, ever practical, pulled Richter aside. "Captain, the pressure on the entrance. If too much snow accumulates, it could collapse the overhang." Richter peered into the maelstrom, his face grim. Already, snow and ice were piling up, forming a rapidly growing drift that threatened to seal them in. The familiar, comforting silhouette of the Fenris, barely visible hours ago, had vanished completely. The camp, their meager tents and supply caches, was gone, swallowed by the raging white. "Conserve fuel," Richter ordered, his voice strained but firm. "Turn off all non-essential lights. Prepare for a long wait." The men huddled deeper into the cavern, the drills now silent, replaced by the terrifying roar of the storm. The air grew heavy with unspoken dread. They were entombed, trapped not by enemy forces, but by the raw, untamed power of the Arctic. Corporal Knudsen, usually stoic, wrapped his fur-lined hood tighter, his eyes darting towards the now obscured entrance, a silent acknowledgement of the primal force that had just asserted its dominance. The fissure, once their refuge, now felt like a tomb. Hunters in the cold. The blizzard had finally receded, leaving behind a world sculpted anew in white, but it had taken their lifeline with it. Weeks had passed since the last supply drop, and the men, once robust and full of purpose, now moved with a deliberate slowness, their faces etched with a gauntness that spoke volumes. The scent of coffee, once a comforting ritual, had vanished, replaced by the faint metallic tang of hunger. Richter watched them during the meager evening meal, a thin broth, barely more than flavored water, and a single hard biscuit. Their chatter, usually boisterous after a day of labor, was muted, punctuated by the hollow rumble of empty stomachs. Private Schmidt, a young man barely out of his teens, swayed slightly as he rose from his seat, his eyes unfocused. Otto Muller, ever the watchful sergeant, steadied him with a firm hand. Richter felt the weight of their suffering press down on him. The mission, the Reich's grand ambition, felt a distant, almost abstract concept when faced with the immediate, visceral need for sustenance. He found Lars Knudsen chipping ice from a frozen bucket, his movements economical, almost feral in their efficiency. Lars, unlike the others, seemed less affected by the hunger, his frame still wiry, his gaze as sharp as ever. "Knudsen," Richter began, his voice low. "We need a solution. The rations won't last another week." Lars paused, his breath pluming in the frigid air of the cavern. He turned, his blue eyes the color of glacial ice meeting Richter's. "The snow is too deep for traps, Captain, and the smaller game, if it's even out there, will be buried." "What about larger game?" Richter pushed, though the thought felt desperate, almost suicidal. "Polar bears? Seals?" A flicker of something, not surprise but a grim acknowledgement, crossed Lars's face. "Dangerous, Captain. Very dangerous. The bears are hungry this time of year too, and seals, they're hard to get at, unless you know their breathing holes." He paused, then added, "But it's not impossible." "Then we will make it possible," Richter stated, his resolve hardening. "You will lead a party. Choose your men carefully. We can spare only a few." Lars nodded, a silent agreement. "Muller should come. He's steady, and Private Hauser, he's got good eyes." The next morning, under a sky that stretched an unbroken canvas of pale blue, the hunting party set out. Richter, Lars, Muller, and Hauser, cloaked in their thickest furs, became small, dark specks against the endless white. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the packed snow and the occasional whip of the wind. Lars, moving with the preternatural quiet of a predator, led them across the frozen tundra. He scanned the horizon, his head turning slowly, like an old wolf scenting the air. Hours passed, the cold seeping into their bones, despite their strenuous movement. Their breath froze on their beards, forming tiny icicles. Muller grumbled under his breath, "This place is cursed, Captain. The spirits of the ice don't want us here." Richter ignored him, his focus on Lars. The corporal suddenly stopped, raising a gloved hand. He pointed to a faint depression in the snow, a barely perceptible disturbance. "Bear," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Fresh tracks, moving north towards the open water." Tension coiled in Richter's gut. The hunt was no longer an abstract necessity. It was an immediate, deadly reality. They followed the tracks, a meticulous, painstaking process. The bear had been large, its paw prints the size of dinner plates, clear indicators of its immense power. The thought of confronting such a creature with their bolt-action rifles was daunting. They reached the edge of a vast, frozen expanse where the ice met the churning, dark water of the Arctic Ocean. In the distance, a dark shape moved, a lumbering behemoth of white fur against the stark blue. The bear. It was stalking something near a patch of thinner ice. "Seal," Lars breathed, confirming Richter's suspicion, trying to catch one at its breathing hole. A plan, desperate and crude, formed in Richter's mind. They would ambush the bear while it was distracted. He signaled to Muller and Hauser, indicating their positions. The wind, a biting knife, was in their favor, carrying their scent away from the unsuspecting predator. They crept forward, each step agonizingly slow, their rifles held ready. Richter's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the frozen silence. The bear, oblivious to their approach, lunged, its massive paws crashing down on the ice. A dark, slick shape thrashed for a moment, then went still. The bear had its prey. "Now!" Richter roared, breaking the silence with the crack of his rifle. Muller and Hauser followed suit, a volley of shots echoing across the barren landscape. The bear, startled, reared up, a guttural roar tearing from its throat. It was massive, far larger than Richter had anticipated, its eyes burning with a primal fury. It began to charge. Lars, however, had held his fire. As the bear closed the distance, he aimed not for its bulk, but for a vulnerable spot. His shot was precise, striking the bear behind its shoulder. The animal stumbled, its charge faltering. Richter fired again, and then Muller, their combined efforts finally bringing the monstrous creature down. Silence returned, thick and heavy, broken only by their ragged breathing. The polar bear lay sprawled on the ice, a testament to their desperate courage. Beside it lay the seal, a bonus they hadn't dared to hope for. Richter looked at Lars, a silent acknowledgement of the corporal's crucial shot. Lars simply nodded, his face unreadable. They began the arduous task of butchering the animals, the work gruesome but imbued with a fierce satisfaction. The meat, once a distant fantasy, was now a tangible reality, heavy and real in their hands. As they dragged the laden sleds back towards the fissure, the setting sun painted the sky in hues of blood orange and deep violet, a stark reminder of the brutal beauty of their new home. The hunger was still there, but now a flicker of hope, raw and primal, burned alongside it. They had faced the cold and its hungry inhabitants, and for now, they had survived. The mountains roar. The shortwave radio's usual static, a constant companion of vital communiques, had transformed into a prelude of terror. Klaus hunched over the receiver in the cramped hut, the lantern's erratic flicker painting monstrous shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The dispatch, fractured by increasingly corrupted relays from a Norwegian outpost, sketched a dire tableau. Stalingrad was a charnel house, the Eastern Front a festering wound. The Afrika Korps was in retreat. Each terse, coded sentence landed like a physical blow, intensifying the isolation, the monumental gravity of their undertaking. He folded the teletype message, its thin paper rustling like dry leaves, and tucked it into his tunic. His face, already chiseled by Arctic rigors, settled into a deeper, more obdurate mask. Here, beneath the indifferent gaze of the polar stars, they represented humanity's last redoubt, the architects of a future sanctuary. He located Schmidt and Mueller overseeing the excavation of a new access tunnel, a narrow, sloping passage burrowing deeper into the mountain's core. The air was thick with rock dust and the metallic tang of sweat. Schmidt, his breath misting in the frigid air, swung a pickaxe with youthful, if somewhat awkward, zeal. Mueller, ever the pragmatist, inspected the timber shoring, tapping the rough beams with an experienced hand. "Captain," Schmidt called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space, "we're making good progress. Another 10 meters, and we should intersect the main fissure." As Schmidt spoke, a low thrum vibrated through the rock floor. It wasn't the familiar groan of shifting ice or the distant howl of a blizzard. This was deeper, more visceral, like the slow, ponderous beat of a gargantuan heart. The lantern, swinging from a ceiling beam, swayed almost imperceptibly. Mueller straightened, his brow furrowed. "Did you feel that, lads?" he grumbled, his usual gruffness replaced by a note of wary respect. "The mountain's rumbling again." Klaus felt it too, a tremor that resonated in his very bones. He scoured the tunnel's ceiling, his eyes narrowed. "Dr. Weiss, have you noted any unusual seismic activity?" he asked, raising his voice to be heard over the faint growing rumble. Dr. Weiss emerged from a side chamber, wiping dust from her face. Her spectacles, pushed onto her forehead, revealed eyes that even in the gloom sparkled with an almost wild curiosity. "Only what's to be expected for a region of such geological volatility, Captain. The permafrost's expansion and contraction, the immense pressures. It's a living, breathing entity, this place." The rumbling intensified, a guttural growl that now vibrated through their boots. Dust began to drift from the ceiling like fine snow. Small pebbles, dislodged from the rock face, pinged against their helmets. Schmidt cried out, stumbling backward as a larger chunk of shale detached and landed near his feet. "Out! Everyone out!" Klaus barked, his voice cutting through the rising din with an urgency that brooked no argument. They scrambled backward, the air filling with a rising crescendo of groans and cracks. Mueller pulled a wide-eyed Schmidt toward the entrance, his large hand firm on the younger man's shoulder. Just as they cleared the tunnel mouth, a deafening roar erupted. The ground beneath them shuddered violently. A cloud of pulverized rock and dust exploded from the tunnel entrance, carrying with it the splintered remains of their timber shoring. The air filled with the acrid smell of freshly exposed rock and a choking, gritty haze. When the dust finally settled, the new tunnel entrance was gone. Solid wall of collapsed rock, thousands of tons of it, now sealed their progress. The mountain, it seemed, had roared its displeasure. Schmidt stared at the impenetrable barrier, his face pale beneath the grime. It's blocked. Completely." Mueller kicked at a loose stone. "Bloody mountain," he muttered, spitting. "Never liked us messing with it." Dr. Weiss, however, was already examining the exposed rock face with an unreadable expression. The fissure network is highly unstable here, Captain. The permafrost acts as a binder, but any significant shift, any localized stress, it's like building in an eggshell. Klaus walked to the collapsed entrance, running a gloved hand over the cold, unyielding rock. The news from the front, the impossible odds they faced, the sheer defiance of the Arctic itself, it all coalesced into a renewed surge of determination. Retreat was not an option. Surrender was unthinkable. "We adapt," Klaus stated, his voice calm, cutting through the lingering tension. "Sergeant Miller, gather every available man, every timber, every length of steel. Dr. Weiss, I need your geological expertise. We will not simply shore this tunnel, we will reinforce it. We will engineer a method that makes it stronger than the mountain itself. We will build a true, permanent structure anchored deep into the living rock. This mountain may roar, but we will make it listen." His eyes, cold and unwavering, met each of theirs in turn. A quiet, unshakable resolve settled over the small group. The fight had just escalated. Long night, fading hope. The Arctic winter clamped down, a suffocating blanket of perpetual night that bled one day into the next without distinction. Months had passed since the Eastern Front dissolved into a frozen grave and the Africa Corps melted into desert sand. Months since the mountain had swallowed their first attempt at entry, only to yield to their stubborn resolve. Now, the new tunnel, shored with salvaged steel and reinforced concrete, snaked deeper into the earth, a testament to their defiance. But defiance was a cold comfort when the sun was a forgotten myth, and the only light came from sputtering generators. Inside the cavernous main excavation chamber, the air hung heavy with dust and the metallic tang of sweat. The rhythmic clang of pickaxes and the low thrum of the rock drills were the constant heartbeat of their existence. Faces, once ruddy with the last vestiges of civilization, were now pale, etched with shadows and the ghost of homesickness. They moved with a practiced weariness, each man a cog in a machine powered by dwindling hope and an iron will. Klaus Richter watched them, his own face a mask of stoicism, though a constant ache throbbed behind his eyes. He saw the flicker of exhaustion in every averted glance, the slump in every shoulder. He knew the stories they dreamt of, the warmth they craved. Tonight, he would try to give them something. During the meager supper of rehydrated rations and lukewarm coffee, Klaus cleared his throat. "Men," he began, his voice cutting through the desultory clinking of spoons. "A story, if you'll indulge an old soldier." A few heads lifted, eyes dull. Otto Müller, ever the pragmatist, merely grunted, stirring his coffee. Ernst Schmidt, however, brightened marginally, a flicker of youthful curiosity in his tired gaze. Klaus launched into a tale of a legendary expedition into the Bavarian Alps, an account embellished with daring escapes from avalanches and the discovery of a hidden, crystalline grotto. He wove in tales of camaraderie, of overcoming insurmountable odds with wit and courage. He spoke of the taste of fresh mountain spring water, the crisp scent of pine, the warmth of a fire against a biting wind. He painted a vibrant picture, hoping to ignite a spark of their own pasts. When he finished, a silence settled, heavier than before. A few men nodded slowly, but no one spoke. The vivid images he'd conjured seemed to vanish, swallowed by the oppressive reality of their subterranean existence. The imagined warmth of a Bavarian hearth was no match for the gnawing cold that seeped into their bones. Ernst, who had listened intently, eventually pulled a worn leather wallet from his tunic. He carefully unfolded a creased photograph, a woman with kind eyes and a child with a gap-toothed smile standing in a sun-drenched garden. His thumb traced the edges, a silent lament. Otto, observing the scene, clapped a hand on the shoulder of a young private who had slumped against the rock face, eyes closed. "On your feet, Private." Otto's voice was gruff but lacked true malice. "This mountain doesn't sleep and neither do we. We have a schedule to keep, a sanctuary to build." He cast a pointed glance at Ernst. "Daydreaming won't cut through rock, Schmidt. Get back to it." Ernst flinched, tucking the photograph away with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the endless night. He picked up his pickaxe, the dull thud against the rock, a monotonous echo of his own dwindling spirit. Klaus watched it all, the silent struggle playing out before him. He understood Otto's harshness. Discipline was the last bastion against chaos in this desolate place. But he also felt Ernst's yearning, a raw, exposed nerve. He knew the burden of command meant sacrificing his own solace for the illusion of strength, the constant battle against the creeping tendrils of despair. The tunnel grew, inch by painstaking inch, a testament to their sheer refusal to surrender. But the cost was evident in the gaunt faces, the hollow eyes, the increasing quiet. The camaraderie, once so robust, had been eroded by the ceaseless grind, replaced by a quiet, shared misery. Hope, he realized, was a finite resource, and in the perpetual night of the Arctic, it was slowly but surely fading. They were building a sanctuary, yes, but at what price to the men who toiled in its shadow? Klaus pushed the thought away. There was no turning back, not now, not ever. Race against the thaw. The first groan rumbled through the permafrost, a deep, resonant sigh that vibrated through the very bedrock of their hidden fjord. It was not the familiar shriek of wind or the grinding crunch of settling snow, but something far more primal, a sound born of immense pressure and impending release. Klaus, emerging from the partially completed entrance of the bunker, felt it in his teeth, a tremor that ran up from the soles of his boots. He scanned the vast white expanse of the fjord, now bathed in a pale, strengthening light that heralded the slow climb of the sun. The colossal ice sheet that had been their impenetrable shield all winter was beginning its reluctant surrender. A hairline fracture, barely visible at first, snaked across the frozen surface of the fjord, a kilometer distant. Then another, branching like a lightning bolt. The groaning intensified, a chorus of deep, resonant moans, punctuated by sharp pistol-shot cracks that echoed off the towering cliff faces. The Arctic, after its long, silent dormancy, was awakening with a vengeance. "Sergeant Muller!" Klaus's voice, usually a low thrum of authority, held a new, sharper edge. "We need to accelerate. Double shifts, round the clock. This thaw will not wait for us." Muller, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with a grimy hand, looked towards the fjord with a grimace. "Aye, Captain. The old witch is stirring. Always knew she had a temper, this one." He spat into the snow, a gesture of defiance against the overwhelming forces of nature. "But the men are exhausted, Captain, and our fuel reserves are precisely why we cannot afford to slow down." Klaus cut him off, his gaze fixed on the fracturing ice. "If this fjord breaks up before the bunker is sealed, our position is compromised. Everything we've worked for, everything we've sacrificed, will be for naught." The urgency in Klaus's voice was unmistakable, a stark departure from his usual measured calm. It ignited a spark in the weary men. Ernst Schmidt, his face smudged with soot and concrete dust, exchanged a wide-eyed glance with Lars Knudsen, who merely grunted, his eyes narrowed at the shifting ice. Even Dr. Weiss, usually absorbed in her geological surveys, emerged from the interior, drawn by the reverberating tremors. Her analytical mind immediately grasped the implications. "Captain Richter, the meltwater will be considerable," she stated, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "The stability of the rock above the fissure could be affected. We need to reinforce the main shaft with additional bracing, and quickly, before the pressure increases." "Understood, Doctor," Klaus affirmed, already turning towards a team struggling with a heavy steel beam. "Muller, reallocate 2 teams to reinforce the upper shaft. Schmidt, you're with them. Lars, keep an eye on the fjord's edge. Report any significant changes immediately." The work took on a feverish pace. The clang of hammers on steel, the whine of drills biting into rock, and the rhythmic pour of concrete became a relentless symphony of desperation. Men moved like automatons, fueled by meager rations and the captain's unwavering resolve. Exhaustion was a constant companion, but the threat of exposure, of their sanctuary being swallowed by the burgeoning spring, drove them onward. The bunker's final shape began to emerge from the raw rock. Thick steel plates, wrestled into place by straining muscles and the straining cables of their aging machinery, formed the inner shell of the main chamber. Concrete, mixed with painstaking care in the frigid air, was poured into the gaps, creating an impregnable fortress within the earth. The air inside the excavation was thick with the scent of damp earth, fresh concrete, and the metallic tang of sweat. Klaus was everywhere, supervising, assisting, lifting, his presence a silent anchor against the encroaching chaos. He rarely spoke, but his eyes, sharp and intense, missed nothing. He saw the tremble in a man's hand, the slump of a shoulder, the glazed look of fatigue. Yet he pushed them, knowing the cost of failure was far greater than any present suffering. One evening, as the perpetual twilight of the Arctic spring cast long, blue shadows across the fjord, a particularly violent crack rent the air. A section of the ice sheet, a segment the size of a small village, visibly detached and began to drift, an ominous harbinger of the coming deluge. The sound of water, trickling at first, then flowing, became audible beneath the ice. Muller ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, his usual gruffness replaced by a rare flicker of fear. "Captain, it's coming apart faster than anyone predicted. We might not make it." Klaus looked out at the churning, groaning ice, then back at the half-finished entrance of the bunker. The steel doorframe was in place, the massive hinges waiting for the final colossal slab of metal. "We will make it, Sergeant," he said, his voice flat, resolute. "Every last man will contribute until the last bolt is tightened. This sanctuary will be completed." And beneath the unforgiving sky, with the very ground trembling beneath their feet, they worked. A race against the thaw, against time itself, to carve out a sliver of hope in a world collapsing around them. The ghost in the ice. The clang of a dropped wrench echoed sharply through the cavernous chamber, a stark punctuation mark in the relentless symphony of construction. Klaus watched, a silent sentinel, as the last hydraulic arm for the main portal was hoisted into place. Sparks showered from the welder's torch, momentarily illuminating the grime and exhaustion etched onto the faces of his men. Their movements were slow, deliberate, each swing of a hammer, each turn of a bolt, a testament to months of brutal labor. The air, thick with the metallic tang of ozone and sweat, hummed with the strained energy of a task nearing its end. He ran a gloved hand over the cold, reinforced concrete wall beside him, feeling the subtle vibrations of the work. This fortress, carved from the unforgiving Arctic rock, was more than just a shelter. It was a desperate gamble, a final redoubt against a world teetering on the brink. Every resource, every drop of fuel, every calorie of their dwindling rations had been poured into its creation. Now, as the final weld solidified around the massive steel frame, a different kind of tension settled in. It wasn't the urgency of construction, but the quiet, profound weight of completion. A guttural cry of triumph erupted from the small crew installing the final locking mechanism. The lead engineer, a gaunt man named Brandt, whose eyes had long since lost their youthful spark, turned to Klaus, a weary smile cracking his chapped lips. "Done, Captain. All linkages secured. Ready for seal." Klaus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Execute." The command was followed by a moment of suspended animation. Then, with a low groan that reverberated through the very bedrock, the colossal steel door began its slow, inexorable journey. Gears shrieked, hydraulics hissed, and the air pressure within the bunker shifted subtly. The light from the vast opening, which had for so long illuminated their toil, began to recede, shrinking into a sliver, then a sliver more. Dust motes danced in the fading light, performing a final ethereal ballet. A final resounding thud echoed through the chamber, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The sound was not merely the closing of a door, it was the sealing of a fate, the definitive end of one chapter and the terrifying beginning of another. Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the men and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the newly activated ventilation system. They were inside. Sealed. Klaus walked through the now silent corridors, his footsteps ringing hollowly on the concrete. The bunker was immense, a labyrinth of reinforced walls and intricate machinery. Storage bays, now mostly empty, stretched into the gloom. He passed the generator room, its massive engines waiting for the signal to roar to life, and the communications center, a nest of dormant equipment. Each space spoke of preparation, of a future he hoped would never fully materialize. He found himself in the main observation deck, a small circular room with a single thick pane of bulletproof glass looking out onto the Arctic expanse. The view was breathtaking, even now. The ice, which had threatened to consume them, stretched out, a vast, undulating white canvas under a sky the color of bruised plums. The setting sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the frozen landscape, painting the scene in hues of violet and deep blue. Alone in the cold silence, Klaus let his gaze wander over the horizon. He thought of the men who had perished, swallowed by blizzards, crushed by collapsing ice, or simply succumbed to the relentless cold. He thought of the desperate orders from Berlin, the frantic scramble to find this hidden fissure, this impossible sanctuary. He had built it, a ghost in the ice, a silent monument to a desperate command. As the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, a faint speck appeared on the horizon. It grew, slowly but steadily, resolving into the unmistakable silhouette of a supply ship. It was breaking through the rapidly melting ice, a powerful icebreaker cutting a path through the increasingly treacherous fjord. The sight was a potent symbol of connection, a fragile lifeline to a world they had just sealed themselves off from. Klaus watched it approach, a solitary figure framed against the immense canvas of the Arctic night. His mission, in a sense, was accomplished. The bunker stood impregnable, a testament to his will and the unyielding spirit of his men. Yet, as the ship drew closer, its powerful searchlights piercing the gloom, he felt no elation, only a profound sense of isolation. They were safe, for now, but what had they saved themselves for? And what would await them when the world outside finally shattered? The questions hung in the cold air, unanswered, as the ghost in the ice prepared to receive its first visitors.